Good afternoon and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland and this week's Full Scottish. My name is Nadia. On this program, this week we are delighted to be joined by journalist and former SPAT, Simon Pia. Welcome, Simon.
Good morning, Nadia.
Good morning, Simon. And it is rather good afternoon, but are we also delighted to, and we are also delighted to welcome writer and activist William Duguid. Welcome and good afternoon, William.
Great to be here at last.
At last. To start with, we will begin with the Middle East update. At least 64,368 Palestinians have been killed and 162,367 wounded in Gaza since 7th October 2023. As Israel intensifies its bombardment of Gaza, it is also continuing to prevent aid to reach the starving people trapped there. Greta Thunberg pointed out that Keir Starmer has a legal duty to prevent genocide, probably why this government refuses to call Gaza a genocide. Ahead of the Israeli president visit the UK next week, the Scottish Parliament voted for the State of Palestine to be recognized internationally. Simon?
Yeah, I think this history will remember Europe and America's moral failure in what's happened. I think I don't think people really fathom that yet, but the whole thing about the international rules order that Europe and America has been prattling on about when it comes to Russia and the invasion of Ukraine, and whenever it suits the West, has been exposed as basically a complete falsehood, and it's exposed our international hypocrisy. And I think people can dig too deep on this issue, and it simply comes down to the fact that America tomorrow wanted this to change. This idea that Netanyahu manipulates America, I think, is false. You saw that over what happened in Iran. America told them to pull back in that recent, the attacks on Iran. So if America and the UK, and I think we should always remember, and as I walked down the high street yesterday, I was on a demonstration about Gaza. Pretty low numbers when you think of it, which I think reflects poorly on Scotland as well, in Edinburgh, my city. But when we look back on what's happened, we'll remember this great moral failure, and the root of it lies with the British, as usual, the British Empire. That's one of the reasons I would always support independence for the breakup of the British state, because I see it continues to do more harm than good. I feel that as in Edinburgh, because Arthur Balfour, the Balfour Declaration, he came from Whittingham in East Lothian, just down the road from Edinburgh. And East Lothian, the county of East Lothian, is basically the size of Gaza, so it gives you some indication of if that has had more bombs dropped in it than Hiroshima had, or even, I think, Germany, even like Berlin or Hamburg during the Second World War. That gives you some idea that people put. Just you imagine what Israel, with the aid of the British air bases in Akrotiri and Cyprus, giving them locations, what has happened. And Britain, remember as well, the first people to bomb Gaza, bomb the Palestinians, was Britain in the 1935 to 1937 Arab Revolt. Over 15,000 people were killed. At that stage, Britain also armed and trained the Zionist militias, who a decade later would finally, establish the independent state of Israel. So many trouble spots in the world. You look to who's behind it or who's played a big part in this, and it is good old Britannia.
Thank you. And William?
Well, that's some good and very interesting historical context that Simon has given, and it basically goes on, and we are complicit. There's almost no doubt about it. And I think it's significant that Keir Starmer and his government will not term this a genocide, because that does leave them open to all sorts of potential comebacks should that be recognised. So, to a certain extent, a genocide is what it is. But if people won't use the word genocide, then this say it's a horrific way of dealing with one another, that will be a stain on history forever, whatever you term it. And it's long past the time when it has to stop. And yes, my hats go out to that small group. Yes, it was a fairly small group. There's an awful lot going on in Edinburgh yesterday, and lots of different things. There were various protests of various sorts going on, including the All Under One banner march, which did, at the rally, have some very trenchant things to say about what was going on in Gaza. But there were also other protests at the Parliament by an anti-immigrant and indeed a counter protest, a pro-immigrant group just beside where the rally was taking place. But my hats go off to these folks who turned up in Edinburgh and wrote their placards. It was a silent protest, mainly, I gather, where they pointed out the absurdity of the group Palestine Action being termed as a terrorist organisation, and therefore, by extension, the very writing of these placards to be in support of terrorism and supposedly deserving of prison sentences of various sorts. I was pleased to see that I think there were probably 3 people arrested somewhere in Edinburgh on that sort of charge through the day, and it's difficult to know where it was. Some reports say there was nobody arrested at the protest in Edinburgh. But I know there were 3 arrested, but I'm not sure whether it was actually at that or at one of the other protests. That's really what I'm saying. In London, there were lots arrested, and that to me is just reprehensible. It's an absurdity that being against genocide and being against this treatment of the Gazan people should be termed an act of terrorism. And that will be recognised in future for the absurdity that it is, but we just haven't got there yet.
Talking about London and Westminster, so Scottish Parliament voted for the state of Palestine to be recognised internationally. And how many of the Labour MSPs have voted? And if some of them have abstained, why did they abstain? Can we discuss on that?
Well, I did look it up. So I looked it up. Simon can say his bit if you like. I'll quickly say 2 voted for the motion: Alex Rowley and Mercedes Villalba. 19 abstained, and I put that down to the Bain principle, where if the SNP suggests anything, Labour will not vote for it, except if they're being rebellious. And my hat's off to the 2 that did vote for it. That's basically the rundown of Labour. Now, of course, Labour may say, well, we're dealing with it in Westminster because we're planning conditionally to recognise Palestine at the UN in whenever it is. If it's later this month, I'm not quite sure. But conditional recognition is no use at all. And I think it's fairly shameful that we should be seeing MSPs abstaining on a call for the recognition to take place.
Yeah. Simon?
Yes, no, I think it's got to be said. Credit to John Swinney and the Scottish government for taking a stance on this. Regards Labour, I think it's quite shameful, the abstentions. I don't think it's just partly what William says about because it's the SNP, they'll vote against it. It's also because the Labour Party, the Labour government, they're basically all signed up to the Israeli lobby, and they're paid by the Israeli lobby. Keir Starmer, Yvette Cooper, the new foreign secretary, David Lammy, the former foreign secretary. The list goes on. If you look at the Labour cabinet, how many of them are Labour friends of Israel? It would take you aback, I think, but it just shows you how much in control they are. And people go on about AIPAC in America having huge influence, Israeli lobby on Washington. it's no less in the UK, I would argue. The Labour Party is totally on board with Israel. And I think I've spoken to people I, who I don't think will vote Labour ever again. Now, I think Labour probably, to a certain extent, we're not that bothered, but they do take people on the left for granted. They do rely on them because they're losing their red wall and they're going to be hit. They're already losing votes to reform in Scotland. To ignore that, but the cynical, it's the inheritors of the Blair legacy. They cynically treat the left of the party and more progressive, internationally minded people, because the Blairite and the Labour government are basically neoconservatives. What is gripping? What is the problem with Gaza? Is that the long-term American policy, and particularly the neoconservative, they want to keep Israel there as their bastion, which the first idea it was by, Ronald Storrs, the governor of Jerusalem in the 30s, we need a little Jewish Ulster to look after British interests in the Middle East. The US hijacked that. Britain, the UK government is a total vassal state virtually of America now. And I think Europe, you used to have people like Chirac, even Sarkozy in France. Merkel was even independent to a certain extent, but before that, Helmut Kohl. All these leaders have gone. You do not get independent, sovereign-minded entities. And Tony Blair led that charge, and Keir Starmer more than fulfills it. But you've seen it with Macron in France, Merz and Scholz in Germany. And the German attitude to pro-Palestine demonstrators is incredible, but there you go. They've absolutely no sense of history. But there's where we're at. But credit to the Scottish government who finally got there. One point I'd like quickly to make, SNP, if they had more of a sense of long-term strategy, they would have moved on this, because they need to suck away more Labour voters into their ranks. There's already Labour voters are getting sucked off towards reform. But if you're looking towards independence, there is a group of, call them the liberal left. These are votes still waiting to be captured. And a stronger stance on this earlier would have helped the SNP a lot, giving them a moral legacy to go into the independence debate, because they're still struggling on the economic front.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we have to move on to the Ukraine update. And President Zelensky has said that nearly 60% of the weapons used by Ukrainians military are domestically produced, already exceeding a target he set 2 months ago. The president added, "These are powerful weapons with many advanced features," in his nightly address. He also pointed to a joint project to undertake weapons production in Denmark. In July, Zelensky called on his government to take measures to boost production of weapons made in Ukraine to more than 50%, higher than any other time since independence from Soviet rule in 1991. Ukraine has focused on drone production and on providing air defenses to counter Russia's intensive drone and missile attacks on Ukrainian cities. An infant is among 3 people who have died in Russian attacks that injured 18 in Kiev and set on fire scores of buildings in the capital, including a government building, Ukrainian officials say. Kiev's mayor Vitaly Klitschko on Sunday said a fire had broken out at the government building in the city center after the overnight attack, which began with drones raining down, followed by missile strikes. A Russia strike in Ukraine's northeastern Sumy region has killed 1 person and wounded several others, local authorities said on Saturday. A Russian drone attack on Saturday evening in Zaporizhzhia in the southeast also wounded at least 15 people, 4 of whom were hospitalized, said Ivan Fedorov, the head of the military administration in the region, which is partially occupied by Russia. A Ukrainian drone attack sparked a fire at the Isky oil refinery in Krasnodar, the administration of the southern Russian region said on Sunday. Polish and Allied aircraft were activated early on Sunday to ensure the safety of Polish airspace after Russia launched airstrikes targeting western Ukraine near the border with Poland. The operational command of Polish armed forces said remains of Poles killed by Ukrainian nationalist insurgents during the Second World War were buried in western Ukraine on Saturday as officials from both countries looked on a move to ease a rare strain in relations between the two close allies. Poland was allowed to exhume the remains in the former Polish village of Puzniki in present-day Ukraine earlier this year after long-standing demands from Warsaw over the issue, which has caused frictions between the neighboring countries. On Friday, Donald Trump said India and Russia seem to have been lost to China after these leaders met with China's leader Xi Jinping this week. Later on Friday, however, he told reporters he didn't think the US had lost India to China. I don't think we have, he said. I have been very disappointed that India would be buying so much oil as you know from Russia, and I let them know that. We are moving on to the Trump's war and the Department of War topic. Trump has signed an executive order rebranding Pentagon as Department of War days after U.S. Navy airstrike killed 11 Venezuelans on a small boat in international waters as he gathers a naval flotilla in the Caribbean. Trump has already threatened war on the city of Chicago in a social media post. William?
Well, branding is important. In this case, it's not particularly cheap, but it's important to move from Department of Defense, which has been the name of that department since 1949. The old Department of War was changed in 1947. Is a really big step from the point of view of just the discourse. The stated mission of the Department of Defense was to provide the military forces needed to deter war and ensure the nation's security that way. Trump, on the other hand, is looking for something that dominates any foe and annihilates any threat to America anywhere and at any time. And that's the rhetoric we're getting. And it's in a way frightening, but it's also in a way depressing that we should be going back in time in this way. And of course, perhaps the immediate victims of the onslaught, or the latest immediate victims, are going to be the citizens of Chicago, where a quite outrageous image was circulated during the week based on Apocalypse Now. And the quote, I love the smell of napalm in the morning becoming the smell of deportations in the morning, and the whole thing being called Chick Apocalypse. Absurd at one level, but basically a declaration of war on a city in the US that is run by Trump's political opponents. In any other world, that would be grounds for impeachment straight off, but in the world of Trump, so far, it isn't. And how the citizens of Chicago deal with this in the immediate future will be significant, because I think Trump is looking for a trigger for either martial law or something even worse. And it's going to be worrying, but historically, it's going to be a very significant few weeks, I suspect.
Thank you, William. Simon?
Yeah, I think Trump is floundering here, and he's doing the classic posture by a weak president, is to still try and look tough, because he's backed off in Ukraine. I mean, people should remember with Ukraine, Kissinger's famous aphorism, it's dangerous to be an enemy of America, it's fatal to be a friend. And they will sacrifice you, they will use you, and they will sacrifice you. And that is the tragedy of the Ukrainian people and what they're facing today. And I think very few people think, the war, it's a matter of time when it's over, and Russia have won this war. They will decide when this war is over, and the Ukrainian people suffer in the meantime. And the EU and NATO has been very weak. Meanwhile, Trump postures, you blow up a supposedly Venezuelan narco smugglers, who knows who was in that boat or when that was actually taken. But he's acting tough regarding Venezuela and throwing his weight about in Washington and in Chicago, as William is clearly set out. So this is for his home market, so he still looks a tough guy. Most American presidents, if not all of them in recent time, want to appear tough guys. When it comes to the crunch, militarily, American production of weapons, missiles, that's a problem in Ukraine. They're running out of missiles and shells, etc., military shells to send to Ukraine. That's part of the reason. But they've given up on that. That's a clear sign, and God knows what's going to happen to Ukraine. If people look back, people should remember Boris Johnson going to Ukraine when Putin and Zelensky, they went to Istanbul a month after the invasion for peace talks. And Johnson went to Kiev, Ukraine, and said, fight on, you can beat them, we'll help you, etc. And if they'd done a deal at the time, Russia would have kept Crimea, most likely. Today, they're getting a large chunk. But more so, this is a war of attrition. Over a million, at least some people put the figure at 1.7 million Ukrainian soldiers have been killed, wounded, etc., gone missing. And it's terrible what has happened to to the country of Ukraine. I'm one of these people, I know it's a minority in the UK. I believe this is a proxy war. To say it's totally, Putin's Hitler is a misreading of it. He wants to march on to Lisbon. That just doesn't make sense. The facts don't back that up. But that country, just think of what lies ahead for it. I know quite a lot of Ukrainians in Edinburgh, and a lot of them, their views have changed about going back. Now they're saying to me, young Ukrainians, we're never going back. And the other side of it for Trump is they'll be spooked by the military display in Beijing when China and Russia and 26 other countries and diplomats from quite a lot of others went to mark the anniversary, the end of the Second World War in the East. And there's this big argument going on within the American defense and diplomatic circles. What is the pivot to Asia, and is China the existential threat? And obviously they do see that, but what they're going to do about that. And I think a lot of people will, in the Pentagon, be thinking they have caught up with us more than we thought after what they saw last week.
Yeah.
So I think going forward, meanwhile, it's ridiculous in Europe to speak about warmongering when I see Rutte, the former Dutch Prime Minister, head of NATO, Callas, making these bellicose. It's fantasy. It's complete fantasy. But they think Merz in Germany, they're going to, even you see it in the UK about increasing rearming. That is the last thing you need, rearming. And I saw Sarkozy wrote a piece in the French press last week saying to Macron, basically, you're a fool, negotiate with Russia, looking forward to see as to continue a sort of conflict with Russia is madness. Gerhard Schroeder, the former Chancellor of Germany, also came out last week backing the AfD leader because she's got this foreign, the idea is negotiate with Russia, don't seek war with them. But if that's a road you're going down, and meanwhile we fantasize and we're groped by a Russia-phobia, it's been part of the British culture since the 1850s. It can go back that far, and we are not in a good position. And just take a look at Ukraine, and it had full backing of NATO and the United States for about 3 years, and look where it is today.
Thank you. We'll move on to the next topic. As the new Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood trails plan to move asylum seekers from hotels into military barracks as Labour try to show they are as tough on immigration as reform, a strategy that is feeding the far-right protest against the UK. Hubert Cooper moved to the Foreign Office and David Lammy took over from Angela Rayner as Deputy FM, a demotion. Ian Murray was sacked as the Scottish Secretary to be replaced by Douglas Alexander. This Home Secretary identifies as a socialist, yet her policies on asylum seekers, military barracks, housing, is it very harsh treatment on the asylum seekers? Or is she reconciling her ideology, or is Labour trying to please Reform UK ahead of 2026 May elections and upcoming conference? What about that, Simon?
Yeah, no, Labour are spooked by reform. If you look at the recent polls, it's quite incredible. If you look at a map of the seats I was looking at last week, Reform would be current polling, they're about 30%, Labour 23%. This is UK wide. So they are, and the red wall that Labour thought they'd regained is totally gone. Labour support is basically, the major core of Labour support is in London. But to call Yvette Cooper a socialist,
No,
I
I
don't
wasn't
think
calling
she would.
you with
I
Cooper.
don't know.
I'm sorry, Simon. I was calling
Sorry, yeah.
Mrs. Mahmood as a socialist. I wasn't calling.
Also, well, I wouldn't call her a socialist either. I think it's flat. I don't think maybe there's about 3 or 4 socialists in the Labour. I would say in the Labour seats in the House of Commons, but they're not. I would say they're centrist, neoliberal centrists would be a better degree. But their attitude to immigration. This is something Scotland has got to hang on to. Scotland's different immigration policy. And the SNP, again, it's credit to the SNP, their stance on this. I should think they should stand strong on it. I think there are slight, or, how big they are, social and cultural differences between Scotland and England on this issue. Reform will probably make certain inroads at the election next year in Scotland, Scottish Parliament elections, but I don't think it'd be a big mistake, and I see no indication of this. And as I said again, credit to John Swinney's not going down that road. The SNP have got to stand firm on this, rather as a Scottish government, and I think they can win out because an awful lot of this is stocked up as well. A lot of it's to do with Labour's bad performance as government, but also so much of it is to do with the media hysteria. I mean, it is an issue, big issue, and how you solve it. But the hysteria you get for you can go back decades, but recently in the last few years, it has been really ratcheted up. The Daily Mail, the Daily Express, the Telegraph, even the Times, the Murdoch papers, the Sun, and that seeps into how the broadcasters and even they create a media climate and the issues of the day. And anyone who's works in the media knows that how television and radio they do react to the right wing thrust of their domination of the political agenda in the UK.
Yeah, thank you. William?
Well, I mean, the gravitational pull of reform is remarkable considering how small its current representation is, but not perhaps so surprising considering how much attention it's had from the media. And I think the way to combat reform is not necessarily to try to be a wee bit more like them, only slightly nicer. And that does seem to be Labour's way of going about things right now. Actually, what would be better would be to go along the lines of what the Scottish Government has been doing and to make a case for how you deal with asylum seekers, and the answer to that should be more efficiently and faster so that their claims are determined in timely fashion. Those that you're not, for whatever reason, accept because they don't, if you don't accept them because they don't meet the criteria, that's fine. Then they go back to where they immediately came from. But if they are becoming genuine refugees, then they're on a pathway where they can work, they can be part of society, and they can ultimately be part of the immigration that Scotland needs in order to sustain itself. And like many countries, but perhaps more so than most countries, Scotland needs working age immigration. We are not replacing ourselves at anything like the rate we would need to replace ourselves in order to keep the economy ticking over and to look after the increasing number of old people that are growing old in Scotland and living. And goodness me, it's good for them to be living to a ripe old age, but we do need to be able to sustain them by having a working population of the right size. So we need to have a different debate, and yet we are sucked into this poisonous debate all the time by the overarching media that pushes us in that direction. And Labour should have a wee bit more courage of whatever convictions it may have left, and maybe take some of that on and take a leaf out of John Swinney's book, in my view.
Yeah, talking about the media and the media and the whole UK government as such, do they think really about the Scotland's need and the what Scotland wants? And there is a sacking of a Scottish secretary, and also we have a new Scottish secretary. Shall we discuss on that, William? Simon, sorry, William. William, yeah.
Well, I'm happy to give it to Simon or whatever.
William.
No,
Yeah.
on you go, William. On you go.
All right. Well, no, not got really too much to say about Douglas Alexander. Interestingly, Douglas Alexander, when he was Trade Secretary under Gordon Brown, was, I think, one of 3 Labour ministers who quietly repaid over £50,000 in expenses, including on a taxpayer-funded second home, while he was also receiving income from a tenant at the same time. So he's back. So there's hope for Angela Rayner, you would think. Maybe she's not gone forever, because it's possible to come back. Also, there have been others who've come back, like Peter Mandelson, I think, came back twice. But Douglas Alexander, I think he is a Scottish secretary who will very much do the establishment, the London establishment's bidding. He'll be even more of a viceroy than Ian Murray was. I don't think his manner goes down particularly well with Scots folk. I don't think he uses language that shows he has Scotland's interests truly at heart. And I think he's probably going to be an even worse appointment than Ian Murray was. And that's going to feed into the Holyrood 2026 election, I should imagine. And so, in a way, because you always want your enemy to do things that go against them, don't interrupt them while they're making a mistake, I'm probably welcoming Douglas Alexander in that sense, but I don't think it's a good appointment.
Thank you. Simon?
I think what William's saying will resonate in Scotland, but it doesn't in London. And once again, this shows, look, people were shocked at Ian Murray going. Ian Murray, most of all, never saw this coming. And I'll say this for Ian Murray. We've had our disagreements politically, but Ian is a good constituency MP. But down in London, they've seen the strength of the SNP going into the Scottish Parliament elections, and people think, in many ways, they say the SNP shouldn't be in such a strong position because the SNP have got quite a lot of things, and you had Nicola Sturgeon's book coming out just reminds everyone about certain ineffectiveness regarding the Scottish government. But the SNP is once again, it's doing remarkably well in polling. Ian Murray was looked in London as not making a dunt at all in the SNP, and it's also a general realignment of the party. Like Pat McFadden's back in a strong position. It's really getting the Blairite control of the party. Peter Mandelson is still very influential. He's an ambassador in Washington. He's poking his nose in all the time and giving guidance to Starmer. So they're trying to just sort of realign the government with, that pathetic phrasing he came out with, delivery, mimicking Blair's education. And I think that delivery will soon fade as it was greeted with a certain amount of ridicule. But Douglas Alexander is quite a smart guy in certain ways, but back, he's been in charge of the Scottish election in the past, and that would raise certain questions. I would not dispute the fact that he's quite intelligent, and London Labour thinks he's a better media operator than Ian Murray, and he's got more of a strategic sense. And you look at where Douglas represents East Lothian, that is, and where Douglas Alexander will attract more Conservative voters. But you look at the Scottish, like Ian Murray had at one stage was the only Scottish MP, and it's Labour's strongest seat in Scotland, Edinburgh South, which I happen to live in, by the way. But as I remember once in a Labour sort of post-mortem on the election, I said, look, the reason why we hold on to Edinburgh South is because Edinburgh South is the least Scottish constituency in Scotland. And people freaked out and said, don't you dare repeat this outside this room. I said, I'll repeat it to anyone who wants to listen to me. It's because there is a lot of English people live in the constituency. That is a fact. It's to do with the university, etc., the makeup of Edinburgh. But that is why, and holding up Ian is something special because he held on to the seat. It had nothing to do with him. It was purely to do with demographics. But Labour, I mean, even speaking to people at Holyrood, I was taken aback last summer or then last autumn, saying to them, the winter fuel benefits, what an own goal that was. They couldn't quite get it. I said, this is going to damage you. Then there's a two-child benefits cap, the national insurance, etc. I mean, I don't think anyone could have predicted that this was going to be as poor a Labour government. And whenever you get a really poor, failing Labour government, that boosts the SNP. The danger is now it is boosting reform to a second extent in Scotland. Most people in the political classes don't want to see reform get a toehold in the Scottish Parliament. But the way it's going at the moment, on the list seats, I think you'll see a few reform MSPs in Parliament. Maybe not as many as the papers are touting at the moment. But what you want to see is the SNP, once again, my criticism of the SNP is that there's nothing bold. They're not connecting well with the electorate. They're not enthusing people. They're holding on to their core vote in a pretty solid manner. And maybe that's a way to, I mean, the idea is that old political adage, imagine you're carrying a Ming vase over a parquet floor, just make sure you don't slip and drop it. But I think, especially you're looking forward to John Swinney's speech on independence,
We will come
independence
on
is
to
a
that.
radical move.
We will come on to that.
Just,
That's one of
yeah.
our topic. We will come on to that topic soon. Yeah. With no thought on consequences for devolved governments, the Chancellor has put back the budget to November 26th. With the UK economy weakening and the cost of living still biting, what will her budget bring? And Simon?
Inflation's risen slightly again in the second quarter. The GDP's dropped a bit. I don't know. I think if I was in the Labour in Rachel Reeves' shoes, I'd go for some infrastructure to try and use that to sort of boost the economy. Because people are, the way the private sector is going at the moment, that is not really getting the wheels of the economy turning again in the way that they would hope. So I think it needs to be government spending, which is something somebody in my political persuasion on the left I agree with. You've got to bring in more taxation. It's something I think. You look at polling. I mean, the problem of the age we live in politics, and all political parties are far too guilty of this. They're cowed by the media, or how will this be, in mainstream media? How will this be perceived and presented? And I think politicians, I think we're in an age where they can't afford to be bolder and challenge it and try and set an agenda. But of course, they will get hammered in the media for it if they did so. And Labour has, made little tiptoe for about a wealth tax, but they always backtrack very quickly. One of the biggest mistakes ever, I think, was that Gordon Brown giving the Bank of England control of interest rates as well, because it took away from government to a certain extent to set the economic course for the country.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. William?
Well, I think Rachel Reeves has got problems because she's restricted what she can do according to what she's already stated. So she will have to go back on that possibly, or she will have to be creative. I think obviously taxes need to rise in some way, but she's already closed off income tax, national insurance, except for employers, and VAT. And so you'd be looking at other sorts of tweaks, and that might be capital gains tax, it might be inheritance tax or whatever. But she might have as much as 35 billion to find in order to close the fiscal gap. I do agree with Simon that infrastructure is sorely needing looked at, and I think that might be something that a road she goes down. It's perhaps significant that she's going to take a little while to consider it, because 26th of November, I believe it is about as late as it can be. And of course, from a Scottish perspective, that's incredibly disruptive in terms of what the Scottish government does, because it gives greater uncertainty over all the fiscal baselines they'll be working with our own budget, and also the Barnett consequentials, which are significant. I mean, they shouldn't be in, and we should have control of everything, in my view, but you know my view on this. But certainly it's going to be very difficult for the Scottish Government to move forward with any certainty with that date of budget in the offing. And of course, if they make any missteps, they won't be cut any slack by the media. You can be sure of that. Yeah. So an interesting outlook over the next 2.5 months, I would say.
And also, we have Scottish election coming, so it is very much needed that we have to have the budget in time, so that we can deal with the things, the spending. We have to have the spending plans and the delivery of the public services and all. Simon, would you like to add something into that?
I think the Scottish government is as William pointed out, it is in a very difficult position about planning ahead and what they will be able to present. But one thing I'd say for the SNP, and it suits them well when it comes to electoral politics, is that overall they can count on Labour getting more blame for things going wrong rather than the Scottish government being held to account. And I don't think the Scottish government is held to account for the economy. And that, of course, naturally enough, because the SNP, and we'll always say they don't have the full levers, which is quite correct. And overall as well, health and if you were to critique the Scottish government going into the next year's elections, health and education, Nicola Sturgeon's legacy, waiting times, etc., educational attainment gap, certain things like the Calmac ferries was reflected, because that is quite a concrete example. You can't get that sorted out. You cannot build the ships, get them into service on time, that sort of thing. But overall, as I said, it's not in my personal instinct to go down this road, but I think it probably is John Swinney, and I think the polls, people would say why, when the polls are reflecting the SNP in a very good position electorally, to be quite cautious and steady as she goes. And that's John Swinney's persona. I don't think it's a persona to lead an independence campaign, but to get through the next year's Parliament elections, it probably will stand the SNP in good stead. And what the SNP, polls are showing the SNP could have potentially, an overall majority with a Green backing. Who knows? But they might be in that strong position.
Yeah, thank you. William, would you like to add something into this?
Not very much to add on that. I think it's all to play for on the election, but we might be talking about that in a moment.
Yes, thank you. Yes, we will move on to the next topic. Yeah. As the Holyrood elections get closer, John Swinney moved the campaign firmly onto the issue of Scottish independence and Scotland's right of self-determination in a speech in Edinburgh this week. A paper setting out how the people of Scotland have the right to decide their constitutional future has been published by the Scottish Government. Your Right to Decide sets out how, following a clear decision being made by the people of Scotland to hold a referendum, It is for both Scottish Government and the UK Government to acknowledge and respect the decision. The paper calls on the UK Government to make a clear commitment to respect the people's right to choose their future. Is calling for a referendum enough, or should the SNP go into 2026 election saying an independent supporting majority in Scottish Parliament would open negotiations for Scotland to be an independent country, William?
Well, I would be inclined to think that yes. I don't particularly like the idea of an election being used to determine a particular topic when all your opponents need to do is say, no, it's not about that, it's about something else. But it seems to me, I think it was the right thing to do to concentrate on Scotland's right to decide, but the implications that you draw from, or the inferences rather, that you draw from that are important. And I would prefer a much more muscular approach to saying, yes, a vote at this or any election that returns more pro-independence MSPs than the opposition, basically, is a signal that Scotland has voted for independence. And that should be directly stated in manifestos, and it should be stated by all pro-independence supporting parties in the manifesto. That's what I believe would work. I think I can understand what John Swinney is trying to do, and Scotland's right to decide is probably not in doubt with most independent supporters, but needs to be sold as a concept to the electorate. And perhaps it's a slightly gentler way of putting it over than independence in itself. But I fear we will get into the same rigmarole where we get the election result, and if it is a positive result, we'll basically ask for a Section 30, and Westminster will say no. And I don't know what the plan B is if that happens.
Thank you. Simon?
William mentioned Section 30, 35. It's locked into the Scotland Act and the Supreme Court's decision about that. It is a difficult constitutional dilemma for a Scottish government if it's returned with the SNP, even if the SNP have an overall majority. But I think the SNP has got to keep banging away on certain aspects of this. I think a good line is there's 1 million people today who didn't have in Scotland who didn't have the opportunity to vote in 2014. They've got to come up with things like that. I mean, no, demographically, from the 2014 vote and polling since then, that the younger the age group, the greater support for independence. I remember in 2014 when the white paper came out, I couldn't believe the lack of input on the economy in that. I remember standing down outside Holyrood with Alistair Darling speaking to him about it, and he couldn't believe it. He thought, God, this is a godsend. We just need to keep going on about pensions and benefits, etc., and we'll win the argument. And I think that was a decisive factor. But you look at the polling, 50% it's hovering about there consistently in favour of independence. Going into 2014, it was 30 to 35%, and look at how it jumped ahead in a well-run. The independence campaign was a lot better managed than Better Together, the unionist campaign. But I don't see, how. I mean, they've got to have certain assurances on the economy. But I don't know what think tanks are operating within the SNP, coming up with ideas, even ideas of what would would there be a Scottish constitution? You've got to seize people's imagination. Another issue, and I tell you, this is what people I don't think about enough, is that security will be a big issue, can be a big issue that the unionist sides could use if it came down to it. Because what we were speaking about earlier, we live in a different world. There's Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the idea of increasing nuclear forces in Europe. All these aspects come into it, and that is a card that don't think that it won't be utilised. And who knows what sort of a position we'll be in a year from now. Things are still very uncertain. So that is a big issue that can be used as a fear factor to wave in the electorate's face, which wasn't there in 2014. Now, I saw even stuff in the papers today about Scotland's nuclear deterrent. People are already going there if Scotland wants to do away with nukes, etc. I actually think, yeah, and yeah, that's a big thing. That there'd be jobs in Rosyth. The Rosyth really lives off the Royal Navy contract, so that would be a big boost for the case for the union, etc. But the other argument you could say to that, well, if you're not, try building them in England and see what happens. But there are going to be these different issues. But there's going to be a bigger culture if reform continually to do as well as the polls are showing. That that is a positive for the independent side, because do you want to go down this mini Trump Farage route that has been laid out before us? I mean, it's a crackpot party. Don't underestimate the power of a crackpot party to attract votes. We live in a crackpot age. The political elite, things like Gaza, overall, even once again Labour coming, Angela Rayner scandal. You're all at it. You're all grifters, etc. William was referring to Douglas Alexander. This resentment against the political classes. Farage is not a mug. He looks what Trump has achieved in the US, and he's trying to press the same buttons. That can work to the advantage of, I believe, the independence cause.
Yeah. William, couple of things you have mentioned. Election shouldn't be used, and I think this particular question I had asked you in a previous discussion we had. The election shouldn't be used for the independence, and also in this particular paper, John Sweeney has mentioned that we have every right, and Section 30, whichever you have mentioned. So what should be a different form we can use if not election is not the way to get the independence? Not demanding, because that's what he's going to do. He's demanding the independence if he has the majority. And if that's not the way, do you have any idea?
Well, yeah. What I said was it's problematic. It's not my preference. I mean, I would much prefer there to be a referendum where it's black and white, one thing or the other, that we focus on, and not the other things which are important, and in fact are important in the context of independence. I'm just saying that it's difficult to get what will be accepted as a clearly defined result in favour of independence in an election campaign, which your opponents will say is about other things as well. I think that, though, we do need to establish the principle that Scotland has got the right to decide, and for voters clearly to understand it, and we should have a principle that each and every electoral event, whether that's a referendum or whether it's an election, is about independence if parties put that in their manifesto in a prominent position. And the different parties can put it in an equally prominent position. That would be great. And we vote on that. But the other thing I would say is that we need a strong independence movement as well as a strong political arm in the SNP. Currently, the SNP is trying to build itself up again, and I think the independence movement is in the early stages of building itself up again. We are, or should be, in a far better position this time than we were in 2014, because within the independence movement, through think tanks like Commonweal, with the Scottish Currency Group, with the Energy Group, with Constitution for Scotland that's been working on a constitution, we've got a lot of these building blocks already in place to put together an offering for the Scottish people that they might be inclined to accept. It's going to be a filthy, horrible campaign, of course, with all sorts of things coming in. And I do agree with Simon that defence and security is going to be an issue in the way it wasn't in 2014. But we can't just wait for reform to do things for us by getting elected and then
Yeah, but
you can see how bad they are. That doesn't work.
Yeah.
That doesn't work
In addition to
unless
that, if
you
I
make
may
it work.
ask, in addition to that, if I may ask you both of you, Labour said Wales constitutionally have the right to have a referendum, and Northern Ireland has got the right to have a referendum. Then why not us? And if they deny our right to have a referendum, how and what should we do, Simon?
What they should do. I think if the SNP get an overall majority again, that's the second time it's done that in a parliament that was set up not to have an overall majority. So I think it does for people to keep working away. I would also keep hammering away at the Supreme Court, even attempting to go back there. And you've got to work on all fronts. But also the fact is that where I would say disagree with your Nicola Sturgeons and your John Swinneys is the softly approach. And I can understand why people recoil from this. Independence is a radical move, whether you like it or not. You don't. Oh, it's not got. At times, I've heard the SNP speak about it. Don't worry, things won't be that different. They almost seem to be saying, like, we'll be keeping the Queen. Why not make a bold move? Scotland would be a republic. We would not have a monarchy. And these are high risk issues. But that's where I'm not a member of the SNP. But that's where I think they should go. They should be prepared to make big, bold statements rather than squeeze or tiptoeing forward and hoping to get there eventually by default. And I know that's not at all John Swinney's, that's not what his inner instincts are in the slightest. But I think that, and I think also what I would like to see is a more vibrant, like the SNP controlled too much. This is just an outsider's point of view. Controlled too much the 2014 referendum campaign. And what you want to see is broad alliances across Scotland and not the SNP solely, like Alex Salmond or whoever wanting, as he did at the time, wanted to call all the shots.
Yeah. Thank you, William. Would you like to add something to that question?
Well, just a few things. The independence movement must be united, and we must pick our battles. The SNP also must pick their battles in terms of the independence debate. And we also have to find a way to inspire our own people within the movement now. The support for independence is at 50%. Support for the SNP is in the 30s. So there is now a large number of non-SNP supporting independence supporters. But a lot of them are totally disenchanted with the hope of anything ever happening. They're scunnered, and we have to unscunner them. And that's actually our most urgent thing, because we need the popular force, the popular will to really rise up in Scotland in the way that it did in that first half of 2014 when it made incredible strides. We're not there yet, and we seriously do need to get there, whatever the result of the election is and whatever the result of the election is.
Thank you. Having that note, it's time for us to wind up. Well, that's for this week's Full Scottish. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. We can only exist with your support. Our programs will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 per month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter and please donate whatever you can afford. Thank you. And thank you again to our guests, Simon and William. Goodbye and thank you for watching.
Goodbye.